We may introduce our third speaker of the day. We are very excited, or myself, I'm very excited to hear you, Gijs Dullaert, about your journey. I read that you've been a leader of a company for 25 years. You approached a new way of leading a company like 15 years ago. And then in 2015, you had a massive change in vision. And I'm thrilled and I'm very curious to learn more about that journey.
So please welcome Gijs Dullaert.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rush and Marianne. You guys are paving a way for people like me that take on a journey which is not easy at all, and we need a lot of support. Thank you, Maaike, for your kind words. And for me, it's an honor to be here and to be able to share my story with you. And I've split it up in a first part that's a talk, a presentation, but I hope to leave some time for an interactive part so that we can have a Q&A as well. So please prepare your questions during my talk, and then I can get back to that after my presentation. But first, I have a question for you. And Rush already pointed to it as well. A very important question: what do you serve? Or in other words, what purpose do you serve? Why do you do what you do? And if you already have a purpose, that's great. And if not, try to capture some words in your head, in a notebook, and start working on a purpose. And for me, when I left university, my purpose was not something that you would expect to get onto a conscious leadership journey. I thought that my purpose would be being financially independent, having freedom from power of others over me. I wanted to, and I thought it was my purpose, to be master of my own fate. And I thought that the fastest way and the most fun way, and for me the best way to do that, was becoming an entrepreneur. So after a couple of years at Shell, with two friends, we became entrepreneurs. And we came in a similar situation as Marianne. We were one of the first companies in the Netherlands helping other companies with their web strategies and getting them to the internet with their first web appearance, web presence. And we were growing fast and we were having a ball. And then we ended up in the dot-com bubble. And we noticed that companies in the US were much bigger than we were. And they were already funded with a lot of capital, or they would go to the stock market, and they were knocking on our door to acquire us. And at a certain moment we thought, well, we are not going to beat these huge guys, so let's join them. And for me personally, it was also a good step towards financial independence. So we start talking with a company, New York-based, agency.com, and negotiating a sale. And we had a meeting in New York, talking about the last bits and pieces of the letter of intent. And at the end of the day, we signed the letter of intent. And everyone was excited. There were people from Goldman Sachs there, and there was a kind of energy, acceleration in the room. But after that I signed that letter of intent, I felt nothing. And I thought, well, Gijs, you should be happy, man. You're finally, at least on paper, financially independent. But I wasn't happy at all. And I started to notice a feeling of betrayal, that I was betraying a dream that we had with the company called Trinspark. And when people were congratulating me, I started to feel ashamed. I just, in my idea, was at the right spot at the right time. It wasn't an achievement at all. So I started to notice that it was not my purpose to become financially independent, but it was something else, but I didn't know what. And quite soon afterwards, there was a second experience that I had, also at the same company, TwinSpark. Because we had grown very fast, we weren't doing that well operationally. So we had quite some problems, and in some areas it was just a mess. And we were talking about that with the management team, and we started having conversations with our employees about accountability. And that they needed to be more accountable and hold each other accountable. But during the process, it started nagging me that I thought, well, is it about them? And then I started to see it was not about them. It was about us. It's the management, stupid. It's me. I learned, and I very clearly saw, I was running the company, we were running the company, and we were making mistakes. And that opened the door to an interest in leadership. I hadn't been running the company very well. So after that I left TwinSpark, I had the opportunity to step into the company that I'm working now, Ames. And quite soon after that I stepped into Ames, I knew for certain two things. I wanted to build Ames for the long run, and I wanted to become a better leader. And I knew that Ames deserved a better leader than the leader that I was. So I became an avid reader of books about management, personal development, leadership, and I started to attend different trainings, mostly focused on personal development. And I want to share a few of them that had a huge impact on me. And some you already saw in the previous presentations. So the first, and I saw in your graph, Rush, that good to great, they didn't do that good after all. But reading that book, I learned about level 5 leadership and about combining humility and will. And that was an eye-opener. I read about serving a greater good. And then in 2005, with my management team, back then we still had a management team, we went to a coach training. And it was very intense. The first 10 weeks was all about learning about ourselves. And then we learned about that the answers are in people, and it's the way you listen to it and the way you ask questions, open questions, but especially listening, not only listening to the words, but also listening to what's not said, listening to the feelings. I learned about my own feelings. I didn't know even how to express them before that. Then I read about servant leadership, probably 2012. I know it was just before I went to the United States to live a few years over there. And in this book from Joseph Jaworski, I learned about how you can start to shape the emerging future for your organization. And again, serve a greater cause. Then, with the management team, we went to another training of the Presencing Institute, Otto Scharmer, Theory U. And that was quite an eye-opener. Otto Scharmer talked about that we are not living in an era of change, but a change of era, needing new answers. And he talked about organization-wide that we would move from hierarchies to networks, system-wise from predict and control to sense and respond. And I learned about intent, and I've struggled with intent since then, but the power of really being committed to something. And I learned to approach challenges, opportunities, people with an open heart, an open mind, an open will. Oh, yeah. And then I came across this book. This is a book from the 70s, from Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled, and it learned me a very important thing. It learned me about love. Not romantic love, not sexual love, but something deeper. This very fundamental energy that could drive immense in things that we cannot imagine. And I don't know whether you know it, but Scott Peck has a definition of love, and it it is in my brain, and I will try to quote it. It's the will to extend yourself for the purpose of the nutrition of someone other's or your own soul. And from the moment that I had read this book, I was convinced that there is a place for love in business, especially in business. And it started a kind of quest, and I still find it awkward to talk about it sometimes, but a quest to make love the most common word in business. Maybe second, wisdom. And then a friend of mine said, Gijs, you gotta read this book. Reinventing Organizations from Laloux. And for me, it seemed that everything that I have read about and that I learned came together. So I was very grateful for it, because it provided a kind of template for us. I don't know whether you read it, but in his book, Laloux talks about the different ways that we humans organized ourselves over the millennia. And that there is this new organizational paradigm emerging, which he calls teal. And Laloux found that in teal organizations, there are three things in common. They have an evolutionary purpose, so it's evolutionary, it changes, but they're very much geared towards the purpose. There's some form of self-management. And the third thing is about wholeness. It's about wholeness of the people working at the organization. You can bring your whole self to your work. You don't have to leave parts behind. And also in the book, I learned about holacracy. And holacracy is, you could say, an operating system to implement self-management and to become purpose-driven. And with our management team, we decided to embrace holacracy and to implement holacracy at Ames. So we got all together with the whole company in Haarlem, people from the US and people from Singapore, to kick off self-management. And before we kicked it off, and it's a physical step for me personally, I signed the constitution, the holacracy constitution, and with that signature, I handed over my hierarchy power as a CEO to the constitution. And it's almost like a 19th century monarch here in Europe that signed the constitution, handing over the power. So from that moment on, I was not anymore the boss. Our purpose is our boss. And you can imagine that that brings a lot of change. It brings a lot of change in the company. It brings a lot of change for me. I have to relearn a lot of things. I was used to lead. And now I have to switch between serving, sometimes just being, and leading. I had to go to a deeper level of trust in people. I cannot step in anymore and just change things like I used to do. But especially for myself also, there was quite a change. So dropping the CEO role, it's good for your ego. It makes you humble as well. And in the beginning, I noticed that I was just cheating and saying at some place that I was CEO. I'm not. And I want to illustrate what changed, because it was signing this constitution was this physical step into a new world, and I couldn't get back. I could not do it anymore. And I'd like to illustrate it with something which is again very on the money side. So at a certain moment, we thought we had 3 big projects that we couldn't finance it with our own cash generation. So I had to go out to find an investor. And it was a kind of coming out, because normally I would go and say, well, I'm this serial entrepreneur and we have built up companies, sold companies. So that would attract the normal growth equity companies that would invest money, 3 to 5 years, have an exit. But we didn't want to exit. We want to build Ames for the long run. So I started talking about, we want to build something for the long run. And by the way, we have self-management and we don't want to change that, or we're not going to change that. And we have something which we combine care and high performance. But care comes first. And financial results, by the way, are results. We see that as results of what we do, not something to go after. And the funny thing is that I could speak out the words like, valuation is not important for us. The alignment is important. But there was also a conversation in my head, and I learned most of that conversation. And the conversation in my head was one voice said, Gijs, what are you doing, man? Valuation? Not an issue? Alignment? Valuation is important. This nonsense about not being important, that you have financial independence. And then the other voice said, Gijs, you're on a conscious journey, and you have to stay there. And I learned so much from those two voices in my head. And I noticed over time that the voice, I will call it the money voice, got a bit more quiet. And what I learned is the more that I got free from that money part, the more I could really serve aims. And I think that is one of the most, it's not a paradox, it's very connected to each other. And I very much believe that it's almost impossible if you are still attained, for me, when I was still attained to the money part, to really start serving a greater cause. So, this is a slide from our strategy slides. This has been there for a year now. And Rush, your book has been there for a year now. And I want to tell a short story about how I got the book. So, I had a conversation with an investment banker. It was a conscious investment banker. And in that first conversation, at a certain moment, he walked out of the room, he came back and he threw this book in front of me and said, Gijs, you've got to read this. And back in the plane to the Netherlands, I got to read this. And I did the same when I came at the office. I said, team, we got to read this. And we're going to build a company where everybody matters. I think that at the moment, at Ames, if you see what's wanting to emerge, if we are able to manifest that, that's perfect. And I will get back to that. But I think at this moment, we may be at 20% of that potential. So we have a long, long, long road to go. But I'm certain and convinced that with Ames, we chose a route to meaning. We are choosing a route that fear, greed, and power is not our core motivator. It's compassion, love, care for our customers, care for our employees, care for our suppliers. And when we started to talk about Everybody Matters a year ago, we had a team meeting of probably 12, 14 people. One of my colleagues, Gert-Jan, spoke up at a certain moment and he was looking at the room and he said, do I matter to you? And it was very palpable that there was emotion in the room. If you think about it, and I started to think about it later on, it's an existential question. Do I matter? And I thought of it and I thought, well, Gijs, you matter. And I know that I matter not because of what I do, what I earn, but I matter because I'm in this lifetime, on this earth. I'm just alive as a human being. And if I do matter because just of that, then my colleague Gert-Jan does matter. So we talked about it and he said, yes, I can feel it as well. I do matter. So if you and I do matter, every I does matter within Ames, but every I does matter here. Every I on the planet, in Asia, in Africa. And that's my dream, not only for Ames, but for every organization, that we can get to a situation where every I does matter. Because that is opening the door to compassion and love. And that we can build conscious businesses led by conscious leaders. To close off this part, I'd like to go back to this first question. And my purpose, Rush, you shared it as well, my purpose is different now. I want to serve and to be with and to lead through love and let compassion and deep wisdom flourish and inspire others to do so as well, so that we can all experience this way of working together and living together. And that's why I wholeheartedly took your invitation to share my story, because I hope it will inspire you to take the step and join a growing guild of conscious leaders to become an apprentice of conscious leadership and start or continue on your own journey towards mastering conscious leadership. Thank you. Now the questions. Yes.
Do we have a microphone or?
Yeah, I think there's a microphone around.
Hello?
Hello. Hi.
Ladies first.
Okay. My name's Dorianne Cotter-Lockhart. Thank you
Dorianne.
very much for telling the story of your journey. And it's not just your journey, but it's also the collective journey that you shared with the people in your organization. I'd like to hear a little bit about the word or the action of patience, because I know it takes a long time for this internal journey of development. So how does patience, or how did patience figure into this journey for you?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I will take your question and make it into an example. So if you look at my journey, it took a lot of time. And 3 years ago, we started with Holacracy. And if you look at the company, and I shared it with a few people, maybe a third is really into it. And maybe a third is halfway into it. And maybe a third is not that into it. And maybe a few people don't like it at all. And then you get this question, how do we deal with that? And the first reaction is, so I even got a project which was called something like, how do we deal with the Holacracy terrorists? So, and I didn't know what to do with it. And the funny thing is, it reminded me of a part of the book of Rush and Bob Chapman, to apply courageous patience. So that's my reaction now, is let's apply courageous patience. And if I took such a long time, I cannot expect for people to change that in 3 years. So yes, it needs a lot of patience. And I think we're so much in the beginning. We're like in the 18th century in the traditional management. So we're experimenting, we're learning, we're making mistakes constantly, and it's not all hunky-dory, totally not. So we need a lot of patience and dedication.
Yeah, thank you as well. It was very interesting to learn a bit more about your journey and get some new book inspirations. For me, what would be very interesting is how did you implement things? Like what guidelines, what practices have been very effective and helped you to overcome challenges that you have already encountered? And the second question to that maybe, which technologies might have been at use or have been very impactful?
Yeah, this is a huge question, and there's also a huge answer to it. But so what I shared is we implemented Holacracy, and you could see that as an operating system to become self-managed, and we really went into it full. So we asked a Dutch Holacracy consultant to help us, and they're still helping us, and we're still very much on that path and learning a lot. I think at this moment we start to learn how to deal with, for example, how we coordinate things, how we do projects that are cross circles. So we are organized in circles, and so what Holacracy tries to do is to have this kind of open source system of what they call apps, so that we can learn from each other. But to be frank, we have to learn a lot by ourselves. For example, how do we deal with salaries? And that's painful at sometimes. And we try to interact with other companies doing the same. But we're inventing new things. And so it's a lot of systems, inventing yourselves and trying things out and getting together, experimenting.
Hi, this is Valentina Stadler. Thank you very much for sharing. I can relate to a lot of things, and it was very interesting. I have a question to that investor story. I'm wondering how it continued. I mean, so what did the investor say? And did they invest, or did someone else invest?
No. So the beauty is...
where did you get the money from?
So the funny thing is, so we thought that we needed it. And it was really the first time that I went out, I had contact with all these investors. And I felt so much, almost physically, I don't want this, that we looked again at it and we thought, well, we can do it ourselves, the first part, and maybe then in 2018, 2019 we need to go out, and sometimes that works. So from that moment on, things came to us, and we're not needing an investor at this moment for that purpose. I think for the long run, it might be good to have a more. I'm a majority investor. I think that's also having a kind of power, and I still feel that, and people in the company feel that. So I'm thinking to get more rid of that position. It might be better to have another way of dealing with that, but we didn't have to do that. So I was freed up from that.
Hi, my name is Clemens Heppner. And again, I'm very grateful for you telling your story. And we heard about the heroic inner journey. And it sounded to me like you did this heroic inner story or inner journey on your path over quite some time, many years.
Yes.
So one question is, what keeps you on that journey? What supports you on that journey to continue? And it sounds to me like you are continuing on that.
Yes.
Maybe you can say something to that. The second one actually is, if I may add that quickly, is it money that is the problem or the profit orientation? What would you say?
That's a good question. The first, yes, it's very much an inner journey. And that journey started for me with this coach training in 2005. And there I met someone, and weekly we have 1 or 2 talks, which very much helped me to find answers. And something else is that during that course, I started to have a kind of daily practice. So my mornings start with meditation, a walk with the dog, and then doing some exercises. And especially the meditation every day helps me. So there are moments that I'm full of doubt. There are moments that I feel very restless about it. But I start to trust that I get back to another position and that the struggle helps me to grow. Then the money side, personally for me it was, you could say, an attachment for me to money, that coming from this point of financial independence and seeking that to reach that, I think maybe I had a bit more struggle with saying goodbye to that and just purely focusing myself on serving, not serving myself but serving others. I think there's something tricky. I also see that in our company. So, and it's constantly you go back and forth. And I try to be at one side. So with sales, for example, how do you deal with a customer? And there's always this drive to close it and to force it. And then I said, let's put some love in it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but more and more it works. So also there, it's this being patient, and I'm sure that in 5 years we will be much more progress there than we are now, and in 10 years more than in 5 years. So it's keeping on that journey. Yep. A last question I hear. Anyone?
I have one question. Would you say that when you put love instead of force, would you say that you have a more organic growth in your company, which would save more the planet?
Well, that's a very good question as well. Our company comes from, so we're heavy in advanced analytics, our base, and we moved that more into supply chain operations. So our early customers were huge companies with huge assets, and that's oil and gas and chemicals. And so a big base of our company, of our customers, is 50 billion plus revenues, and they have the internal people that can work with our software. So we moved more and more downwards, and we are in a transition. We cannot say goodbye to all those customers, but you already see starting that we want to go to another place, and I say, you know, maybe in 10 years, 50% of the things that we can do have a positive impact on society. So we are looking how can we embrace that. And we started to say no to our first customer because no one wanted to work with that customer. So that starts off. And I'm pretty sure that, well, in due time, everything that we will do will have a positive impact. But it's a transition for us. So we come from a completely non-conscious business, which is difficult for me as well. It was the last question, I think. Yeah? Okay.
Yes.